Picture for a moment a world without banks as we know them. A world where a king's treasure is locked in a castle vault, where a merchant's fortune is vulnerable to every highwayman on the road, and where financing a long journey is a logistical nightmare. Now, imagine a solution emerging not from a royal court, but from a brotherhood of warrior monks. This is where our story begins, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, calculated world of ledgers and contracts. The Knights Templar, famed for their martial prowess, were in fact the architects of the most sophisticated financial network of the Middle Ages. But what happened when that network was violently shattered? The common tale ends with their destruction, their treasure lost, their legacy buried. But the truth is far more fascinating. Their greatest asset was never a chest of gold. It was a system of thought, a revolutionary way of moving and managing wealth. And when the hammer fell, that knowledge did not disappear. It simply went underground. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a coordinated strike ordered by King Philip IV of France sought to wipe the Templars from the earth. Their properties were seized, their members arrested, their very name condemned. It was an attack designed to capture their wealth and extinguish their power. But it failed to account for their most valuable possession, an asset that could not be confiscated: the intricate financial intelligence held in the minds of their treasurers, clerks, and logisticians. These individuals, the master bankers of their age, suddenly found themselves exiled, hunted, and stripped of their official status. Yet they were far from helpless. They carried with them the blueprints for an economic revolution. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, they dispersed like seeds carried on a secret wind, finding sanctuary in the remote highlands of Scotland, the burgeoning ports of Portugal, and the independent cities of the Alps. They brought with them the tools to rewire entire economies from the inside out, operating not with swords, but with balance sheets. So why does this clandestine migration of economic ideas from the 14th century matter to us today? Because it is a powerful lesson in how knowledge, especially forbidden or suppressed knowledge, can become a catalyst for profound change. It shows us that transformation doesn't always happen with grand announcements and public recognition. Sometimes, the most significant shifts occur in the shadows, implemented by individuals who must remain nameless. In this video, we will follow the covert trails of these exiled Templars. We will explore the financial instruments they pioneered, the letters of credit that became the foundation of modern banking, the risk mitigation strategies that enabled international trade, the accounting practices that brought clarity to complex economies. We will see how their influence, though deliberately erased from the official record, helped shape the economic landscape of Europe and beyond, leaving a legacy that echoes in our global financial systems to this day. This is the untold story of how a group of outcasts, working from a position of scarcity and secrecy, helped lay the groundwork for the modern economic world. The quiet of a Friday morning in October 1307 was shattered by the sound of armored fists pounding on heavy wooden doors across the Kingdom of France. Before the sun had even fully risen, royal officials acting on sealed orders from King Philip IV moved with chilling coordination, arresting hundreds of brothers of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. This date, Friday the 13th, would be forever stained in history with an aura of misfortune, born from this very act of calculated betrayal. But to see this event as merely a religious purge or a simple power grab by a cash-strapped king is to miss the true magnitude of what was happening. This was, in essence, a hostile takeover of the most advanced financial institution the world had yet seen. The Templars were more than warriors. They were the bankers to popes and monarchs, the trusted custodians for countless nobles, and the indispensable facilitators for pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Their network of preceptories, stretching from London to Jerusalem, functioned as a medieval version of a multinational corporation, complete with an internal system of credit, secure asset transfer, and meticulous accounting. King Philip, drowning in debt largely owed to the Templars themselves, recognized that seizing their physical assets, their castles, their lands, their chests of coin, would solve his immediate financial crisis. What his plan failed to capture, however, was the true source of their power. The real treasure wasn't locked in a vault. It was stored in the minds of their administrators and the intricate, trust-based web of their international connections. While the king's men secured property deeds and melted down silver plate, the most valuable commodity of all, the knowledge of how to create and manage wealth on an unprecedented scale, slipped through their fingers. The formal structure of the order was crushed, but its intellectual capital, its financial DNA, did not simply vanish. It fragmented, scattering with the fleeing brothers who managed to escape the dragnet. This forced exile of expertise, this unplanned diaspora of economic innovators, set the stage for a silent revolution. The very act intended to erase the Templars from history instead unleashed their most potent ideas into the wider world, planting seeds that would eventually reshape the economic landscape of Europe in ways King Philip could never have imagined. With the formal structure of their order in ruins, the surviving Templars faced a stark choice: surrender to almost certain imprisonment or death, or vanish into the shadows. For the bankers, the treasurers, the logisticians, the men whose value was measured in knowledge, not combat, the path was clear. They had to disappear, and they had to do so with purpose. This was not a panicked, disorganized scramble. It was a calculated, strategic exodus executed by an organization that had perfected the art of moving men and material across continents. They leveraged the very network they had built for pilgrims and princes, turning it into an underground railroad for their own salvation. Imagine the whispered conversations in the dead of night, the pre-arranged signals, and the trusted captains waiting off deserted coastlines. Their escape routes were as sophisticated as their financial operations, a clandestine web stretching across Europe. They traveled not as a unified army, but in small, inconspicuous groups, their famous white mantles discarded for the rough wool of merchants or the humble robes of pilgrims. Their most precious cargo was not chests of gold; those were far too easily seized, but the priceless, intangible wealth of their expertise. They carried in their minds the intricate details of the Templar financial system, the protocols for letters of credit, the formulas for calculating exchange rates, the complex methods for managing vast estates. They were living libraries of economic innovation, and their dispersal represented the scattering of that library's most critical volumes. One primary artery of escape led north and west across the Channel to the British Isles. But while England was unsafe under the watchful eye of King Edward II, who eventually bowed to papal pressure, Scotland was a different matter entirely. Robert the Bruce excommunicated himself for defying the Pope in his struggle for Scottish independence, had no love for the authority of Rome or Paris. He offered a defiant sanctuary. Templar ships, perhaps departing from hidden coves in Normandy or Brittany, could have made the journey to the Scottish coastline, finding refuge in the remote highlands where royal authority was thin. Here, among the misty glens and ancient castles, these financial experts found a kingdom desperate for economic stability after years of brutal war. Their skills in organization and fund management would have been invaluable to Bruce as he worked to build a functioning state from the rubble of conflict. Another crucial route pointed south to the Iberian Peninsula. In the Kingdom of Portugal, King Denis I saw the Templars not as heretics, but as invaluable allies who had been crucial in the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rulers from the peninsula. Rather than persecute them, he negotiated with the Pope to formally dissolve the Templars in Portugal and immediately establish a new order, the Order of Christ, in 1319. This was not just a rebranding, it was a seamless transfer. Templar properties, assets, and most importantly, personnel, were simply absorbed into the new organization. For Templars fleeing France, Portugal offered a rare and incredible opportunity, a chance to continue their work almost uninterrupted, but now under the official protection of a sympathetic crown. This route was less about hiding and more about a formal, state-sanctioned continuation. Other paths led into the heart of Europe, to the politically fragmented and mountainous regions of the Alps. The complex patchwork of independent cantons and bishoprics in what would become Switzerland provided ideal hiding places. A traveler could cross a mountain pass and be in an entirely new jurisdiction, beyond the reach of any single pursuer. The Templars' reputation for neutrality and their experience in managing secure, autonomous communities would have resonated with the fiercely independent Alpine peoples. It is here that some of the most enduring legends of Templar survival took root, suggesting they played a role in the foundation of the Swiss Confederation and perhaps planted the early seeds of the discrete banking culture for which the region would later become famous. And for some, the most logical escape was a return to the east, to the fading Crusader states of Outremer, like the island fortress of Cyprus. These were places where the Templar name still held weight, where they had long-standing bases and familiarity with the local powers. While these territories were precarious, they existed on the very fringe of papal control, a margin that offered a degree of safety. This strategic dispersal was not random. It was a targeted migration to regions that offered either political protection, like Scotland and Portugal, or obscurity and strategic distance, like the Alps and Cyprus. In each of these havens, the exiles began the quiet work of transplanting their economic knowledge, setting the stage for a silent revolution that would reshape local economies from the ground up. Now let's break down exactly how this system worked, because its brilliance lay in its simplicity and security. That French nobleman wouldn't simply hand over a bag of coins and get a receipt. The process was far more sophisticated. First, he would meet with the Templar treasurer at the Paris preceptory. Together, they would agree upon the exact sum to be deposited. This wasn't just a number written down. The Templars employed a system of codes and ciphers to protect against forgery. The resulting letter of credit would contain specific phrases, unique seals, and perhaps even a pre-arranged password known only to the initiating and receiving preceptories. This transformed a simple piece of parchment into a secure financial instrument. The nobleman could then travel light, carrying only this document and perhaps a small amount for immediate expenses. His wealth was effectively invisible to the thieves and pirates who preyed upon medieval travelers. Upon his arrival in a city like Acre, he would present his coded letter to the local Templar commander. The officials there would verify the seals and codes against their own records. If everything checked out, they would dispense the funds in the local currency, be it Byzantine bezants or Saracen dinars, after deducting a modest fee for the service. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of using a debit card abroad today, avoiding costly currency exchange booths and the risk of carrying large amounts of cash. This system was revolutionary because it solved one of the biggest bottlenecks in the medieval economy: the physical movement of precious metal. Coins are heavy, bulky, and incredibly vulnerable. Transporting them required armed guards, slow wagons, and incurred significant costs. More importantly, moving large quantities of coinage out of a kingdom could destabilize its entire economy by causing a shortage of specie. The Templar letter of credit elegantly bypassed this entire problem. Value was transferred electronically, not in the modern sense, but through the movement of information, the trusted message between 2 points in a network. The actual gold and silver stayed put, secure in the Templars' fortified treasuries. The only thing that moved was the promise, the credit. This not only made individual travel safer, but also began to lubricate the wheels of international trade. A merchant in Genoa could now pay for spices from Alexandria without ever shipping a single gold florin across the Mediterranean. He could use a Templar intermediary to effectively transfer the purchasing power. When the order was dissolved, the Templars who escaped carried this revolutionary concept in their minds. They couldn't replicate the vast, official network of preceptories, but they could adapt the core principle. An exiled Templar settling in, say, a bustling Scottish port like Aberdeen, might use his expertise to facilitate trade between local wool merchants and Flemish buyers. He could act as a trusted middleman, holding funds from the Scottish merchant and providing a coded letter that the merchant's agent could present to a contact in Bruges. This created a new, smaller scale and clandestine network of trust. The exiled Templars became the nodes in a shadow financial web, applying their understanding of secure value transfer to stimulate regional commerce. Their greatest contribution was not just the letter itself, but the underlying idea that trust could be institutionalized, that a promise could be as valuable as a coin, if that promise was backed by an unimpeachable reputation. This foundational shift from a purely material economy to one that included abstract credit was perhaps their most enduring legacy, a seed of modern finance planted in the fertile soil of necessity and exile. But the Templars' financial genius extended far beyond simply moving money from one place to another. Their most sophisticated innovation involved making dormant assets come alive, a concept we would recognize today as asset securitization. Think of a wealthy medieval lord. His power and wealth are tied up almost entirely in his land, thousands of acres of fields, forests, and vineyards. This land produces food, timber, and wine, which is valuable, but the land itself is illiquid. It's a fixed asset. You can't easily sell a portion of a castle or a field to raise a large sum of cash quickly. The land just sits there, its potential for generating financial leverage largely untapped. The Templars, however, saw this situation not as a fact of life, but as a problem to be solved. As managers of a sprawling international portfolio of donated estates, they had become experts at unlocking the latent financial power within real estate. They didn't just farm the land, they financialized it. They developed systems for turning these static properties into dynamic sources of continuous revenue and flexible credit. One method they perfected was the use of annuities. A lord might need a large infusion of capital, perhaps to fund a military campaign, to build a new fortress, or to pay a ransom. Instead of selling a piece of his ancestral land permanently, a drastic and often dishonorable act, he could approach the Templars. They would arrange for a loan using the land itself as collateral. But the repayment structure could be ingenious. The lord might grant the Templars the right to collect the revenues from a specific estate for a fixed number of years, say 20 or 30. Alternatively, he could grant them a perpetual annuity, a yearly payment drawn from the estate's income. For the lord, this was a way to get the cash he needed without losing ownership of the land forever. For the Templars, it was a way to generate a predictable, long-term income stream from an asset they didn't even own outright. They were, in effect, creating a financial product from the land's future productivity. This practice transformed a lump of earth and its annual harvest into a tradable, income-generating security. When the order fell and its members were exiled, this advanced understanding of finance did not disappear. These master asset managers carried their knowledge with them into their new lives. In regions like the Kingdom of Aragon or on the island of Cyprus, they found local nobility who were wealthy in land but poor in liquid capital. An exiled Templar, perhaps now serving as a steward or financial advisor to a sympathetic baron, could introduce these very concepts. He might show his new patron how to use a sprawling but underutilized vineyard not just as a source of wine, but as collateral to secure a loan for building a new mill or a fleet of merchant ships. He could structure complex agreements that allowed the lord to leverage his landholdings to fund ambitious projects that would, in turn, increase the land's overall value. This was a radical shift in thinking. Land was no longer merely the basis of feudal power and agricultural subsistence. It became a balance sheet item, a tool for capital formation and economic expansion. The exiled Templars acted as catalysts for this shift, teaching their hosts how to see their possessions not just as territory, but as a financial engine. This quiet introduction of asset securitization principles into regional economies allowed wealth to be mobilized and put to work, stimulating growth and development in a way that a purely agrarian economy never could. To understand the potential impact of these exiled financiers, we need to first appreciate the dire economic situation Robert the Bruce faced after his famous victory. Winning a battle is one thing, funding a kingdom is another. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Scotland's independence in principle, but the nation was economically shattered. Years of war with England had devastated farmland, disrupted trade routes, and drained the royal treasury. The Scottish crown struggled to collect taxes from an impoverished population, and its coinage was often debased and unreliable. More pressuring still was the constant threat of economic warfare from the south. England could and did impose trade embargoes, blockading Scottish ports to strangle the fledgling nation's commerce. For Bruce, establishing financial stability was not just an administrative task, it was a matter of national survival. He needed to build a functioning state economy almost from the ground up, and he needed to do it quickly, with limited resources and against powerful external pressures. It was into this precarious environment that the exiled Templars allegedly arrived, offering a set of skills uniquely suited to the challenge. The assistance these shadowy figures could have provided would have been practical and transformative. One of the most immediate problems for any medieval monarch was cash flow. Revenues from land taxes and customs duties trickled in slowly and unpredictably, while expenses for armies, diplomats, and castle maintenance were constant and urgent. The Templars were masters of cash flow management on a continental scale. It is conceivable that they advised Bruce's officials on creating a more centralized and efficient treasury. They might have introduced systems for anticipating revenue, creating budgets for royal projects, and establishing a clear protocol for managing the crown's debts. Instead of relying on ad hoc loans from wealthy nobles which could create dangerous political obligations, the Scottish crown may have begun to operate on a more professional financial footing. The exiles' experience with managing the complex finances of a large, dispersed organization like the Templar Order would have been directly applicable to organizing the finances of a nascent kingdom. Furthermore, their expertise in moving value securely would have been a powerful tool against English economic pressure. With traditional trade routes through England often blocked, Scotland had to cultivate alternative avenues, trading with France, the Low Countries, and the Baltic states. This required moving money across these new, longer distances. An exiled Templar, using his knowledge of letters of credit and trusted contacts in foreign ports, could have helped Scottish merchants circumvent English embargoes. A merchant in Edinburgh could deposit funds with a royal official, now operating with Templar-inspired methods, and receive a document that his counterpart in Bruges or Danzig would honor. This would allow Scottish wool, hides, and salmon to be sold abroad, and essential goods like salt, iron, and wine to be imported, all without the physical risk of moving bullion and without relying on English-controlled financial channels. This ability to keep trade flowing was the lifeblood of the Scottish economy during its most vulnerable years. The evidence for this influence is, by its very nature, circumstantial but compelling. There is no official royal charter that says, "Paid to Brother Templar for services rendered." The proof lies in the outcomes. After a period of profound disruption, the Scottish crown under Robert the Bruce and his successors demonstrated a remarkable degree of financial resilience. They managed to fund continued military campaigns, engage in international diplomacy, and begin major building projects. This suggests the implementation of a sophisticated fiscal apparatus that appeared rather suddenly for a kingdom of Scotland's size and recent trauma. The sudden appearance of more complex accounting records in certain Scottish burghs during this period also hints at the introduction of new financial practices. It is the quiet, behind-the-scenes nature of this transformation that makes the Templar connection so plausible. Their contribution wasn't about leading charges or ruling from a throne. It was about building the invisible scaffolding of a modern state economy, allowing Robert the Bruce to secure not just a battlefield victory, but a lasting peace founded on economic stability. For these exiled financiers, attempting to rebuild their own organization was an impossible dream, a sure path to discovery and persecution. The famous red cross on a white mantle was now a mark of treason, not honor. So they adopted a far more subtle and ultimately more effective strategy. They became ghosts in the machine. Instead of standing apart, they deliberately vanished into the bustling, noisy world of medieval commerce, seeking anonymity and a new purpose within the powerful merchant guilds that controlled trade in cities like Genoa, Venice, and Bruges. These guilds were the engines of the late medieval economy, collective organizations that regulated everything from quality standards to trade routes. For a Templar on the run, a guild offered the perfect cover. It was a closed society, but one based on professional merit and commercial success, not noble birth or religious orthodoxy. A man with a mysterious past but undeniable skill could find a home here, especially if that skill could make his new brothers wealthy. The process of integration would have been a masterclass in reinvention. Shedding their old identities, these men arrived in port cities as humble merchants or experienced clerks, perhaps claiming to have learned their trade in the distant markets of the Levant, a story that was technically true, yet carefully omitted their specific affiliation. Their most powerful asset was their practical, hands-on experience. While a local merchant understood the price of wool in Flanders, an exiled Templar understood the intricate web of trust, credit, and risk management required to move that wool safely from Flanders to Italy and then on to Alexandria. This was knowledge that couldn't be found in any ledger book in Venice. It was earned through decades of running a pan-European financial network. They didn't need to boast about their past. Their competence spoke for itself. By consistently demonstrating an uncanny ability to structure profitable deals, mitigate losses, and navigate complex international transactions, they quickly earned the respect and trust of their guild peers. Influence in this world was not granted by a title but won through demonstrated value, and these silent partners had immense value to offer. Once embedded in positions of authority, perhaps as a guild treasurer, a senior arbitrator, or a lead negotiator for trade contracts, they could begin their quiet work of transformation. Their influence was exerted not through grand decrees, but through the gradual introduction of more efficient and reliable practices. For instance, medieval trade agreements were often vague, based on oral traditions and personal relationships, which led to frequent disputes. An exiled Templar, accustomed to the Order's meticulous written contracts, might subtly advocate for more standardized written agreements. He could introduce clauses that clearly defined the responsibilities of each party, the quality standards for goods, and the procedures for handling losses due to storms or piracy. To his guild brothers, this would simply seem like sound business practice, a welcome innovation that reduced ambiguity and conflict. They wouldn't see it as the implantation of a Templar system, but as a clever improvement from a particularly astute member. Similarly, the Templars' expertise in risk assessment could revolutionize how a guild planned its trade voyages. Sending a ship laden with valuable goods across the Mediterranean was a colossal gamble. A former Templar logistician could bring a more analytical approach. He might introduce methods for evaluating the seasonal patterns of pirates, the political stability of foreign ports, and the creditworthiness of potential trading partners. This moved decision-making from pure speculation towards calculated risk, allowing the guild to allocate its resources more wisely and ensure its ventures more effectively. They also brought with them sophisticated systems for resolving commercial disputes. Instead of resorting to costly and unpredictable legal battles or violent feuds, a Templar-trained arbitrator could institute fair, evidence-based mediation processes within the guild. This internal justice system saved time and money, fostering a more stable and predictable commercial environment that encouraged larger investments and more ambitious trade missions. The cumulative effect of these subtle innovations was a gradual but significant elevation of the entire guild's financial and operational sophistication. The silent partners didn't seize control, they elevated the capabilities of everyone around them, weaving the threads of Templar financial wisdom directly into the fabric of European commerce, one successful trade deal at a time. This principle of trust was the absolute bedrock of everything the Templars achieved financially. For 200 years, their reputation for incorruptibility was their most valuable asset. A king could trust them with his treasury, a pilgrim with his life savings, because the Order had proven time and again that their word was their bond. This wasn't just a marketing slogan, it was a core part of their monastic identity, backed by the severe discipline of their rule. Their entire banking empire rested not on contracts enforceable by kings, but on a belief in their unwavering honor. But after 1307, that famous name was toxic. The very reputation that had been their shield was now a target. They were publicly branded as heretics, their integrity shattered by the accusations of a powerful king and pope. In exile, they were starting from zero, or even less than zero. They had to build trust not from a position of strength, but from one of profound weakness and suspicion. How do you convince a Scottish wool merchant or a Portuguese ship captain to entrust you with his fortune when your own order has been condemned by the highest authorities in Christendom? The answer lies in one of their most ingenious adaptations. They could no longer leverage the institutional trust of the Templar Order, so they pivoted to something more fundamental and far harder to destroy: the power of personal connections and demonstrated reliability. The first and most crucial resource they had was each other. The diaspora did not mean every man for himself. A web of discrete, pre-existing relationships survived the purge. A treasurer who had served in Cyprus would have known the commander who had once been in charge of the Paris treasury. These men shared a common experience, a secret language, and an unbreakable bond forged in adversity. This allowed them to create a shadow network of endorsement. Imagine a Templar who had successfully established himself as a financial advisor to a minor noble in Aragon. A merchant from that region looking to do business in Flanders might be hesitant to deal with a stranger in Bruges. The Aragonese Templar could provide a subtle, coded letter of introduction to his counterpart in the north. This wasn't an official letter of credit anymore, it was a personal guarantee. It said, in effect, I vouch for this man. The person you are about to deal with operates by our old, unspoken code. His word is as good as mine. This transformed international trade from a gamble with strangers into a transaction between members of a secret, honor-bound fraternity. The network was invisible to outsiders, but for those within it, it provided a level of security that no royal charter could offer. Beyond these hidden affiliations, trust was rebuilt through painstaking, day-by-day demonstration of competence and honesty. An exiled Templar couldn't just announce his skills, he had to prove them through action. He might start small, perhaps by helping a local merchant balance his books more accurately, revealing hidden profits and eliminating wasteful expenses. He might arrange a simple but secure payment for a shipment of goods, ensuring the seller received his money promptly and the buyer got his merchandise without hassle. Each successful transaction, no matter how minor, was a brick in the foundation of his new reputation. He became known not as a former Templar, but as the man who always delivered what he promised, the man whose calculations were never wrong, the intermediary who could resolve a dispute fairly. This grassroots reputation for unwavering reliability was arguably more powerful in the long run than the faded glory of the Order's name. It was trust earned through performance, not inherited from an institution. It was personal, tangible, and directly tied to the economic well-being of the people he worked with. This newly forged trust became their most potent and invisible tool. It allowed them to create functional credit systems in places where formal banking was unknown. In a Scottish burgh, the local bailiff might not understand complex finance, but he would trust the quiet, capable foreigner who had consistently helped the community thrive. That trust meant the bailiff might be willing to advance funds for a harbor improvement based on the exile's projection of future tax revenues, a primitive form of municipal bonding. The ability to inspire this kind of confidence enabled them to mobilize capital and stimulate economic activity without any official title or authority. Their influence flowed not from a crown-granted license, but from the silent, collective agreement of a community that had learned to believe in them. In an age defined by suspicion and localized loyalties, these exiled bankers mastered the art of building cross-border trust on a human scale, creating the social capital necessary for the economic revolutions they quietly engineered. Operating in the shadows required more than just discretion. It demanded a new way of speaking. For the exiled Templars, financial survival depended on their ability to discuss complex transactions in public without revealing their true nature to eavesdroppers or hostile agents. The solution was a linguistic cloak, a specialized vocabulary and set of coded phrases that made their conversations sound like mundane business chatter to the uninitiated, while conveying precise financial instructions to those in the know. This wasn't just professional jargon, it was a sophisticated tool for operational security, allowing them to rebuild their economic networks right under the noses of the very authorities that had sought to destroy them. Think of it as a secret handshake, but made of words, a way to identify allies, convey trust, and protect valuable knowledge all at once. Consider the central problem of interest. The medieval church strictly forbade usury, the charging of interest on loans. For a public banking institution like the pre-suppression Templars, this was a major hurdle. They navigated it with creative financial instruments that disguised interest as something else. After their exile, this practice became a matter of survival. They couldn't afford to have their transactions labeled as usurious by local priests or officials, so the language of their deals was carefully sanitized. The word interest would never be uttered. Instead, a loan agreement might include a gift to be given by the borrower in gratitude for the service, a sum carefully calculated as a percentage of the principal. Or the Templar might charge a fee for the labor and risk involved in managing the transaction, or a penalty for late payment that was, in reality, built into the original terms. To an outsider listening in, a discussion about a loan would sound like a negotiation over compensation for a service, not a violation of canon law. This linguistic sleight of hand was essential for conducting business in a deeply religious society without attracting accusations of heresy. This coded language extended far beyond simple loans. The entire process of a letter of credit was shrouded in terminology designed to obscure its true function. What we would call the principal amount might be referred to as the pledge or the trust. The act of depositing funds could be described as entrusting a matter to an associate. The coded document itself might not be called a letter of credit, but rather a testament or a sealed instruction. The verification process at the other end involved phrases and questions that sounded like personal greetings or religious benedictions but were, in fact, security checks. A receiving agent might ask, "How fares the weather in your homeland?" The correct response, "The sun shines on the faithful," would confirm the bearer's authenticity. This transformed a financial transaction into a ritualized exchange, its true meaning hidden in plain sight within the flow of ordinary conversation. It was a way to create a secure channel of communication using the everyday materials of speech. The mastery of this financial dialect also served as a powerful gatekeeping mechanism. When an exiled Templar began to integrate into a local merchant guild or a noble's court, he would initially be cautious. Before revealing any of his advanced methods, he would slowly introduce this specialized lexicon to those he deemed trustworthy. He might compliment a young, sharp-minded clerk on his diligence, then casually use a term like balanced ledgers or future yields in conversation. If the clerk showed recognition or curiosity, it was a sign of potential. If he looked blank and confused, the Templar would know to be more guarded. By gradually teaching this language to a select few, the exile wasn't just transferring knowledge. He was building a new, inner circle bound together by a shared understanding. Those who learned the code became part of the financial subculture he was cultivating. They could then communicate efficiently and securely among themselves, their discussions about arbitrage opportunities or debt structuring sounding like incomprehensible gibberish to their competitors. This created a significant business advantage based on information asymmetry. The spread of this linguistic key had a profound and lasting impact. As these trusted local partners rose to prominence within their own economies, they continued to use the terms and concepts taught to them by their mysterious mentors. The specialized vocabulary began to seep into the common language of commerce in certain regions. Words and phrases that had once been part of a secret Templar code gradually became the standard terminology for banking and trade in places like Lombardy, Catalonia, or the Hanseatic cities. This process effectively laundered the Templar financial knowledge, integrating it so deeply into local practice that its origins were forgotten. The very success of their linguistic strategy ensured their own anonymity. The terms they pioneered to protect their secrets eventually became the public language of European finance, a final, ironic testament to the depth of their influence. Their greatest trick was to make their revolutionary ideas sound so ordinary that no one ever thought to ask where they came from. while other exiled Templars were forced into hiding, blending into merchant guilds or seeking refuge in remote highlands. Their brothers in Portugal experienced a fate so different it seems almost miraculous. Here, the story diverges from one of clandestine survival to one of official, state-sponsored reinvention. The key to this unique outcome was King Denis I, a ruler with a far more pragmatic and grateful view of the Templars than his counterpart in France. For decades, the Knights had been crucial allies in the Reconquista, the long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. They had manned castles on the frontier, provided military leadership, and managed the vast tracts of land granted to them by the crown. King Denis saw them not as a threat, but as a national asset. When the papal orders for suppression arrived, he faced a dilemma: how to obey the Pope without sacrificing one of his kingdom's most valuable institutions. His solution was a masterpiece of political and bureaucratic maneuvering. Instead of launching a violent purge, King Denis entered into negotiations with the papacy. He acknowledged the formal dissolution of the Templar order within his lands, thus technically complying with the decree. But then, in a move of sheer brilliance, he immediately petitioned for the creation of a new, entirely Portuguese military order. In 1319, just a dozen years after the arrests in France, Pope John XXII officially established the Order of the Knights of Our Lord Jesus Christ, or simply the Order of Christ. This was not merely a change of nameplate on the door. It was a legal and spiritual transfer of immense proportions. All Templar properties within Portugal, their sprawling monasteries, their fertile farms, their strategic castles, were formally transferred to the new order. More importantly, the personnel were absorbed. The same men who had once worn the red cross of the Templars now donned the new, similar cross of the Order of Christ. For these individuals, the transition was seamless. They kept their homes, their duties, and their purpose, all under the explicit protection and patronage of the Portuguese crown. This royal backing was the critical factor that supercharged their economic activities. No longer operating in the shadows, the former Templars could now apply their financial expertise with the full force of the state behind them. The Portuguese crown, ambitious and expansionist, had grand plans that required vast sums of money. The new order, with its inherited Templar knowledge of international finance, asset management, and long-term investment, became the kingdom's de facto treasury and venture capital fund. They managed the crown's revenues, arranged loans for military campaigns, and most significantly, began financing the incredibly risky and expensive voyages of exploration down the coast of Africa. The Order of Christ became the economic engine for Portugal's ascent as a global power. The connection is personified in the figure of Prince Henry the Navigator. In the following century, Henry would not only champion these voyages of discovery, but would also serve as the Grand Master of the Order of Christ from 1420. This was no mere honorary title. It meant that the prince had direct control over the order's immense wealth and its network of financial experts. The funds needed to build the new, more seaworthy caravel ships, to pay their crews for years-long journeys, and to establish trading posts in newly discovered lands like Madeira, the Azores, and along the African coast were funneled through the order. The Templar system of secure credit and careful accounting allowed Prince Henry to bankroll a century of exploration that would eventually open a sea route to India, fundamentally altering the balance of world trade. The financial principles honed by the Templars for managing pilgrim traffic to Jerusalem were now being scaled up to manage a global commercial empire. This Portuguese case study stands as the most direct and unambiguous continuation of the Templar economic model. There was no need for secrecy or subtle integration. The knowledge was preserved institutionally and deployed strategically on a national scale. The Portuguese economy was not just subtly influenced, It was deliberately rewired for a single, monumental purpose: global expansion. The former Templars provided the financial infrastructure that turned a small kingdom on the edge of Europe into a pioneering maritime empire. Their story in Portugal demonstrates that the most powerful legacy of the exiled knights was not just their ability to survive in hiding, but their capacity, when given the chance, to openly power one of the most ambitious economic and geographical projects in human history. While we often picture the Templars in the halls of power, their economic influence extended deep into the countryside, right down to the humble peasant tilling the soil. Managing thousands of acres of donated farmland was a core part of their operations, and this required a practical, hands-on relationship with the rural population. They weren't absentee landlords content to simply collect rents from afar. To maximize the productivity of their vast estates, and therefore their revenue, the Templars developed a system of supporting the very people who worked the land. This often involved providing small, short-term loans to tenant farmers. Imagine a peasant family facing a lean winter or a poor harvest. They might need to buy seed for the next planting season, replace a broken plow, or acquire a new milk cow. Local moneylenders, if they existed at all, would charge exorbitant, crippling rates of interest, trapping borrowers in a cycle of debt from which they could never escape. The Templars, operating with a longer-term perspective on estate profitability, stepped into this gap. They would advance the necessary funds or goods, not as an act of pure charity, but as a smart investment in the future productivity of their own asset. The terms were far more reasonable than those offered by predatory lenders, ensuring the farmer could repay the loan after the harvest without losing his land or livelihood. This practice of micro-lending, of providing small-scale credit at the grassroots level, was a sophisticated tool for rural economic stabilization that the Templars perfected. When these estate managers and agricultural specialists were forced into exile, they carried this pragmatic philosophy with them. A Templar who had once overseen the grain production on a preceptory in Normandy might find refuge as the steward for a local clan chieftain in the Scottish Highlands. There he would encounter a similar set of challenges, a rural economy perpetually on the brink, vulnerable to bad weather, poor harvests, and a lack of capital for even the most basic improvements. Drawing on his past experience, he could introduce a more structured and compassionate approach to rural credit. Instead of the chieftain simply demanding tribute from his tenants, the former Templar might advise a system where the clan itself would act as a source of small loans. Surplus grain from a good year could be stored not just for famine relief, but as a kind of revolving loan fund. A farmer could borrow a bushel of seed oats in the spring, and after the harvest, repay a bushel and a modest additional amount, which would then be available to loan to another family the following year. This created a self-sustaining cycle of capital within the community, insulating it from the worst shocks of a subsistence economy. The impact of this bottom-up financial engineering was profound, though it would never make it into the chronicles of kings. For a peasant in the Alps or the Highlands, the difference between dealing with a Templar-influenced steward and a traditional lord or moneylender was the difference between survival and destitution. Access to affordable credit for tools or livestock could mean a marginally larger harvest, which in turn meant better nutrition for the family, a small surplus to sell at market, and the ability to pay rents or taxes without falling into a debt spiral. This incremental improvement in individual lives, when multiplied across an entire region, led to a more resilient and productive agricultural base. Communities became less vulnerable to famine and less dependent on external, often exploitative, sources of capital. The land itself benefited, as farmers with a stake in their own success were more likely to invest in soil improvement and sustainable practices. This quiet work of stabilizing rural economies from the ground up may seem a world away from financing crusades, but it was arguably just as revolutionary. It demonstrated an understanding that true economic strength is built on a foundation of secure and prosperous local communities, a principle that these exiled financiers applied silently in the distant corners of their new homes. The skills of a master builder are not easily hidden, and for Templars who possessed knowledge of architecture and engineering, their exile presented a unique opportunity to contribute in a highly visible, yet perfectly deniable way. While their financial acumen worked its magic in the ledgers of merchants and kings, their understanding of large-scale construction allowed them to leave a different kind of mark on the landscape, one made of stone and mortar. A medieval building project, especially something as ambitious as a castle or a major church, was far more than a simple construction job. It was a complex economic engine that could transform a local economy for years. The Templars had unparalleled experience in managing these vast undertakings, having erected some of the most formidable fortresses in the Holy Land and a network of commanderies across Europe. They knew how to source materials, manage a large and diverse workforce, and keep a project on schedule and within a budget. In their new homes, this expertise became a form of currency they could trade for patronage and protection. Consider the sheer scale of such an endeavor. To build a stone keep or a fortified bridge required mobilizing an entire region's resources. First, there were the quarriers, the men who spent their days hacking great blocks of stone from the earth. Then came the carters and bargemen, responsible for transporting this immense weight of material, often over difficult terrain. At the site itself, you would find a small city of specialists, master masons who designed the structure and laid the critical corners, journeymen cutters who shaped the stone, laborers who mixed vast quantities of mortar, and blacksmiths who sharpened tools and forged metal fittings. Beyond the core construction, there was a whole supporting economy. Woodcutters supplied timber for scaffolding and roofs, charcoal burners provided fuel for the forges, and farmers and bakers worked to feed this army of workers. A single major project could employ hundreds, even thousands of people from all walks of life, pumping wages into the local economy for the duration of the build, which could span a decade or more. An exiled Templar with experience as a project overseer would have been invaluable to a local lord looking to enhance his defenses or prestige. Imagine a baron in the Scottish borders, keen to fortify his lands against English incursions. He has the ambition and the rough idea, but he lacks the technical knowledge to execute it efficiently. A stranger arrives, perhaps recommended for his quiet competence, who speaks with authority about load-bearing walls, the optimal slope for a defensive mound, and the most effective way to organize a work site. This man, our anonymous Templar, could take the Baron's vision and turn it into a reality, not as a hired swordsman, but as a master of logistics. Under his direction, the project would avoid costly mistakes. He would know where to find the best limestone, how to design a gatehouse that was both imposing and defensible, and how to sequence the work so that the foundation was set before the winter frosts. His management would save the patron money and time while ensuring the final structure was of the highest quality. The economic impact of this competent management was a powerful, covert stimulus. The wages paid to the workers didn't just disappear, they were spent in the local market. The carpenter bought new boots from the cobbler, the mason's family purchased bread from the baker, and the blacksmith invested in more iron from a nearby mine. This circulation of money created a ripple effect of prosperity, boosting businesses far removed from the construction site itself. Furthermore, the project itself often created permanent infrastructure. A new bridge could open up a trade route, a fortified mill could protect a vital food source, a new church could become a pilgrimage site that continued to generate economic activity long after the last stone was laid. The skills learned on the job were another form of lasting investment. A young local man who worked as an apprentice to a master mason learned a valuable trade that he could then take to the next project, raising the overall level of craftsmanship in the region. The Templar overseer, in effect, was not just building a castle, he was teaching a community how to build. The physical structures that still dot the landscapes of Scotland, Portugal, and the Alps are more than just potential hiding places for lost treasure. They are the silent, enduring monuments to these exiles' second act. They stand as testament to men who, stripped of their titles and their brotherhood, chose to build rather than destroy, using their knowledge of stone and scale to stimulate growth and foster stability, leaving a legacy etched not in parchment, but in the very land itself. The allure of a hidden treasure, a fabled fortune of gold and jewels spirited away from the clutches of King Philip, is a story that has captivated imaginations for centuries. It's a romantic notion, one filled with cryptic maps, secret vaults, and the promise of unimaginable wealth waiting to be discovered. But this focus on a physical hoard, while thrilling, obscures a far more valuable and transformative reality. The true treasure of the exiled Templars was not something that could be locked in a chest or buried on a remote island. It was intellectual property. It was the sophisticated system of economic thought they carried in their minds, a system that represented a quantum leap beyond the financial practices of the 14th century. While legends whisper of gold, the historical record, when read carefully, points to a different kind of wealth altogether. The quiet, systematic introduction of advanced financial principles into regions that were still operating on a rudimentary economic footing. To understand the gap they filled, we need to picture the typical medieval economy outside of major commercial hubs like Venice or Genoa. For most people, even many nobles, wealth was starkly physical. It was coin in a strongbox, grain in a granary, livestock in a field. Transactions were often conducted through barter or with a limited supply of often clipped and debased coinage. The concept of credit existed, but it was usually informal, personal, and fraught with risk. Trust was a local commodity, not an institutional one. There were no standardized contracts, no reliable ways to move large sums across long distances, and accounting, if it was done at all, was often a simple list of receipts and expenses. This was an economy of tangible objects where value was directly tied to a physical substance. Into this world, the exiled Templars brought something radical, the power of abstraction. They understood that value could be represented by a promise, that trust could be systemized, and that wealth could be made dynamic and productive rather than static and hoarded. The principles they subtly injected into these local economies were the very building blocks of modern finance. The most crucial was the idea of fiduciary trust, the concept that one party could reliably hold and manage assets for another. Before the Templars, entrusting your wealth to someone outside your immediate family or feudal lord was an immense gamble. The Templars, through their legendary reputation for honesty and their meticulous record-keeping, had institutionalized this trust on a continental scale. In Exile, they taught by example that a transaction could be based on the integrity of a system and the professionalism of its operators, not just on a personal handshake. Then there was the mechanism of long-distance credit, which we've explored with their letters of credit. This wasn't just a convenience for pilgrims. It was a revolutionary tool that separated monetary value from its physical form, allowing capital to flow across borders and stimulate trade in a way that moving chests of silver never could. Perhaps their most significant, though often overlooked, contribution was in the realm of accounting. The popular myth focuses on a secret treasure, but the real secret was their method of tracking it. There is compelling, albeit indirect, evidence that the Templars used a sophisticated accounting system that bore the hallmarks of double-entry bookkeeping. This method, which would not become widespread in Europe for another 200 years, involves recording every transaction in two separate accounts, showing both the source and the use of the funds. This creates a self-balancing system that provides a clear, accurate, and comprehensive picture of an organization's financial health. For the Templars, managing assets from England to Jerusalem, such a system was not a luxury, it was an absolute necessity. An exiled Templar treasurer, now managing the finances of a Scottish earl or a Portuguese merchant house, would have naturally employed these meticulous methods. The sudden appearance of more complex, balanced account ledgers in certain regions after the Templar dispersion is a quiet but powerful clue to their influence. It's in these dry columns of numbers, not in cryptic symbols on parchment, that we find the real evidence of their passage. So how do we, as historians and curious observers, separate this financial reality from the seductive pull of conspiracy theory? The key is to shift our focus from the dramatic to the mundane, from the singular event to the gradual process. We must look for the anomaly, the unexpected sophistication. We shouldn't be searching for a map to a secret cavern. Instead, we should be examining the tax records of a Scottish burgh and asking why, in the decades after Bannockburn, the accounting suddenly becomes more detailed and systematic. We should study the ledgers of a merchant guild in Bruges and note the introduction of standardized contract forms that bear a striking resemblance to Templar precedents. We should analyze the estate records of a nobleman in Aragon and uncover evidence of complex loan agreements and annuity structures that appear seemingly out of nowhere. The proof of the Templars' economic rewiring is not written in a single document that says, "A Templar did this." It is woven into the very fabric of local economic life, revealed in 1,000 small, cumulative improvements in practice that emerge in regions known to have offered them refuge. The treasure was never lost, it was spent, invested, and integrated into the foundations of our economic world, so successfully that we no longer recognize its original source. Of course, the meticulous management of their far-flung empire required more than just trust and innovative credit instruments. It demanded an equally revolutionary system for keeping track of it all. While the Templars were masters of moving value across continents, their true genius may have lain in their ability to account for every single penny, liver, and denier with an almost supernatural precision. To manage an operation that stretched from the rainy highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked plains of Palestine, a simple list of income and expenses simply wouldn't suffice. They needed a system that could provide a clear, instant, and unambiguous picture of their entire financial health at any given moment. This is where the concept of double-entry bookkeeping enters the story, a practice that would not become standard in Europe for another 2 centuries, yet one that the Templars, in their relentless pursuit of order, may have pioneered out of sheer necessity. The difference between the old way and their potential new way is the difference between a rough sketch and a detailed map. Most medieval accounting was a simple single-entry system. Imagine a Lord Steward with a parchment scroll. On one side, he might list all the rents collected from tenants that year. On the other, he'd list all the money spent on feasts, repairs, and soldiers' wages. At the end of the year, he'd tally it up. If the income side was larger, it was a good year, but this system was riddled with holes. It was incredibly difficult to detect errors or fraud. If a payment was recorded incorrectly or omitted entirely, it could throw the entire calculation into chaos. More importantly, it gave no real insight into the Lord's overall wealth. It showed cash flow for a period, but not his total assets, his castles, lands, and treasures, or his total liabilities, the debts he owed to others. It was a snapshot of a narrow stream, not a survey of the entire financial landscape. Double-entry bookkeeping, by contrast, is a system of profound and beautiful logic. Its core principle is that every financial transaction has two equal and opposite effects. For every debit, there must be a corresponding credit. If you sell a barrel of wine for 10 gold coins, you don't just record the 10 coins coming in. You also record the barrel of wine going out. Your cash account increases and your inventory account decreases by the same amount. The system is always in balance. This creates a powerful built-in error-checking mechanism. If your books don't balance, if your total debits don't equal your total credits, you know immediately that a mistake has been made somewhere, and you can hunt it down. For an organization like the Templars, managing complex transactions involving currency exchange, land leases, and loans across different kingdoms, this kind of accuracy was not just helpful, it was a matter of survival. It allowed them to see not just how much cash they had on hand, but the complete picture, what they owned, what they owed, and their true net worth at any given time. The evidence for their use of this system is fragmentary but deeply suggestive. While no perfectly preserved Templar double-entry ledger has survived, historians point to the astonishing complexity and accuracy of the records we do have from their trial. During the investigations, royal officials seized and scrutinized their account books, expecting to find evidence of corruption or mismanagement. Instead, they found records of such clarity and detail that they baffled the king's accountants. The Templars could apparently account for revenues and expenditures across hundreds of preceptories with a level of consistency that suggests a unified and sophisticated system far beyond the norm for the era. Furthermore, the earliest known examples of fully developed double-entry bookkeeping appear in the ledgers of Italian merchant banks in the 14th century, in cities like Genoa and Florence, cities that were major trading partners of the Templars and, as we've discussed, likely destinations for exiled Templar financiers. It is not a giant leap to imagine that these merchants learned the system from the very experts who had been forced to flee their former lives. When these exiled treasurers found new employment, they brought this meticulous mindset with them. A former Templar bookkeeper now working for a count in the Alps or a merchant guild in the Low Countries wouldn't have arrived with a textbook. He would have arrived with a deeply ingrained habit of mind, a need for order and balance. He might have looked at the noble's chaotic scroll of expenses and income and quietly begun to reorganize it. Instead of one long list, he might create separate pages for different types of assets: land, buildings, cash, loans receivable, and corresponding pages for liabilities, debts owed to other lords, unpaid wages, obligations to the crown. Each transaction would be recorded twice, ensuring that the count always knew his true financial position. To the count, this new clerk was simply a miracle worker, bringing unprecedented clarity to his affairs. He wouldn't have called it double-entry bookkeeping, he would have called it competence. But the effect was the same: the introduction of a financial technology that reduced error, prevented fraud, and enabled much more sophisticated planning and investment. The silent integration of these accounting principles into local economies was like upgrading from an abacus to a computer. It allowed for a quantum leap in economic management, all thanks to the discreet influence of men who understood that true power lies not just in wealth, but in the precise knowledge of where that wealth resides. Yet when we picture the Templar Order, our minds almost always conjure images of the iconic knight in his white mantle, a sword in one hand and a banner in the other. This focus on the warrior monk, however, obscures a far larger and more operationally critical part of the organization: For every knight who fought on the front lines, there were dozens of other individuals who kept the entire vast enterprise functioning. The Templars were not just a military force, they were a multinational corporation, a sprawling agricultural conglomerate, and a sophisticated bank. And you cannot run an institution of that scale and complexity with soldiers alone. The real economic engine was powered by a diverse and often overlooked population of sergeants, clerks, scribes, stewards, and lay associates. These were the non-combatants, the administrators who managed the day-to-day operations that generated the wealth which funded the knights' campaigns. Consider the sheer breadth of roles required. A major Templar preceptory, like the one in Paris, was a hive of economic activity. There were treasurers who handled the delicate negotiations of loans and letters of credit. Accountants maintained the intricate ledgers that tracked income from thousands of estates across Europe. Scribes meticulously copied contracts and correspondence, ensuring a permanent record of every transaction. Stewards oversaw the agricultural production on Templar lands, managing the harvests, the livestock, and the labor of thousands of tenant farmers. Then there were the artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons who maintained the order's properties and infrastructure. And finally, there were the lay associates, pious men and women who were not full members of the order but who worked for it or donated their services, often bringing specialized skills from the secular world. This entire supporting caste operated in the background, but they were the true custodians of the Templar system. The knights were the public face. These individuals were the institutional memory and the practical intelligence. When the purge came on that fateful Friday the 13th, the royal officials of King Philip IV were undoubtedly targeting the high-profile leadership, the knights and commanders. This focus on the martial elite inadvertently created an escape route for the very people who held the order's most valuable secrets. A sergeant who managed a grain warehouse in the French countryside, or a clerk who kept the books for a small commandery, was far less likely to be on the king's arrest lists than a famous knight. They were not as easily identifiable, they did not wear the iconic white mantle with the same prominence, and they were dispersed across a much wider and more remote network of agricultural and administrative centers. While the knights in major cities were rounded up, many of these essential workers had the time and the anonymity to slip away into the surrounding populace. They melted into the landscape, taking with them something far more valuable than any single chest of relics: the intimate, practical knowledge of how the Templar economic machine actually worked. The survival of this knowledge, therefore, depended not on the escape of a few high-ranking officials, but on the quiet integration of these skilled professionals into secular society. Imagine a Templar accountant trained for years in the order's meticulous bookkeeping methods. He escapes the initial arrests and makes his way to a bustling commercial city like Cologne or Barcelona. Needing to earn a living, he offers his services to a local merchant guild. His skills would have been immediately recognizable as superior. He could balance complex ledgers with an ease that local scribes could only marvel at. He understood concepts of cash flow, asset management, and long-term financial planning that were generations ahead of common practice. He wouldn't have arrived announcing himself as a former Templar. He would have simply been an exceptionally competent bookkeeper. But in performing his job with unmatched proficiency, he was silently transplanting Templar financial practices into a new environment. Similarly, a steward who had managed a dozen Templar farms in Normandy might find employment with a local bishop or a wealthy landowner. He would bring with him a systematic approach to estate management that maximized productivity. He might introduce crop rotation techniques he had learned from the order, or more efficient methods for collecting rents and tithes. He would understand how to leverage the land's value, perhaps suggesting ways to use future harvests as collateral for improvements like new mills or irrigation systems. To his new employer, this steward was simply a godsend, a man of remarkable organizational talent. The origin of that talent, the years of training within the highly disciplined Templar infrastructure, would remain his secret. This process of stealth knowledge transfer happened countless times across Europe. Templar-trained scribes became city clerks, standardizing legal and commercial documents. Former logisticians found work organizing the supply chains for major building projects. Their individual contributions seemed small, but collectively, they acted as a slow drip infusion of advanced economic and administrative techniques into the bloodstream of medieval Europe. The knights may have been the heart of the order, but it was these quiet, indispensable individuals who ensured that its financial intelligence did not die when the heart stopped beating. They became the invisible professors of a new economic literacy, ensuring the survival of their knowledge not through grand proclamations, but through the quiet, diligent practice of their trades. Now, let's turn our gaze to the high, rugged valleys of the Alps, a world away from the royal courts and bustling port cities we've explored so far. This was a landscape of political fragmentation, a complex mosaic of independent cantons, bishoprics, and feudal lordships where no single ruler held ultimate sway. For an exiled Templar, this very lack of central authority was its greatest attraction. The Alps offered a natural fortress of mountains and passes, where crossing a border meant simply hiking to the next valley, effectively placing oneself beyond the immediate reach of any pursuer from France or the Papal States. It was in this environment of fierce independence and practical neutrality that the exiles found a new kind of sanctuary, and where their particular set of skills found a uniquely receptive audience. The Alpine communities, constantly navigating alliances and rivalries between greater powers, valued above all else the principles of discretion and reliability, the very currency the Templars had to offer. The needs of these emerging Swiss cantons were perfectly aligned with the exiles' expertise. As these communities grew in confidence and wealth, particularly from the lucrative trade routes that snaked through the mountain passes, they faced a pressing problem: how to safeguard their accumulating capital. They were surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbors, the Dukes of Savoy, the Habsburg emperors, the French crown, all of whom might look upon a growing treasury in a remote Alpine valley as a tempting target for taxation or outright seizure. What these communities required was not just a vault, but a system built on absolute discretion and political neutrality. They needed a way to protect their wealth without provoking their powerful neighbors. Into this delicate situation came individuals with a proven track record of managing and securing assets for clients who demanded the utmost confidentiality. The exiled Templars understood that true security wasn't just about thick walls. It was about creating a reputation for impartiality so strong that all parties, even rivals, would trust you to be a fair custodian. While drawing a direct, documented line from a specific Templar to the founding of the first Swiss bank is a historical step too far, the parallels in underlying philosophy are striking and difficult to ignore. The core tenets that would, centuries later, become the global brand of Swiss banking: client confidentiality, asset security, and political neutrality, feel less like a spontaneous invention and more like the slow, organic growth of a seed planted long ago. The Templars had operated a pan-European financial network that respected no single king's authority. Their loyalty was to their clients and their own order's rules. Similarly, the Swiss cantons developed a banking culture that explicitly stood apart from the political squabbles of Europe's monarchs. The Templars' legendary discretion with the financial affairs of popes and princes prefigures the famous Swiss banking secrecy laws. It is a compelling thought that the exiles, in sharing their methods with the guardians of Alpine wealth, may have helped cultivate an intellectual environment where money could be seen not as a tool of state power, but as a neutral commodity to be protected with sober, impartial professionalism. Consider the practicalities of how this influence might have spread. An exiled Templar, perhaps one who had served as a treasurer or vault master, wouldn't have arrived in a place like Zurich or Bern and announced a plan to start a bank. Instead, his integration would have been far more subtle. He might have been employed by a city council to help reorganize the municipal treasury. His first contribution would likely have been to implement rigorous systems of accounting and record-keeping, ensuring that every tax coin was accounted for and that the city's financial standing was crystal clear. But his most valuable advice would have been strategic. He could have counseled the city fathers on the importance of formalizing a policy of neutrality in financial matters, arguing that by pledging to safeguard the assets of all parties equally, whether from Milan, Vienna, or Paris, the city could make itself indispensable and therefore secure. This transforms the city from a potential target into a trusted, neutral ground, a Switzerland in miniature. Furthermore, the Templar understanding of secure physical storage would have been invaluable. The Alpine regions were famous for their natural fortifications, caves, remote high valleys, and easily defensible mountain passes. A Templar logistician would have seen the potential for creating ultra-secure storage facilities in these locations, far from the main roads and prying eyes. He might have advised on the construction of fortified granaries and treasuries, not just to protect against armies, but against the petty corruption and insecurity that could plague a growing community's wealth. By helping to establish these protocols of security and discretion, the exiles were not building banks as we know them, but they were laying the essential groundwork. They were helping to build a culture of trust. They were teaching the Alpine communities that their greatest strength lay not in military power, but in becoming the one place in a turbulent Europe where a bag of gold coins could be left unattended, and everyone would know as an unspoken rule that it would be there untouched when its owner returned. This cultural shift, this embedding of financial integrity into the regional identity, was the true seed from which the mighty oak of Swiss banking would eventually grow. Now, let's consider a merchant in a bustling port like Marseille, preparing to send a shipment of olive oil to traders in Alexandria. His profit doesn't just depend on the price of oil, it hinges critically on the value of the coins he will receive. He might be paid in a mix of Byzantine gold bezants, Arab silver dirhams, and perhaps even Venetian ducats. Each of these currencies has its own intrinsic value based on its metal content and its relative scarcity in different markets. A bezant might be worth more in Egypt than it is in France, while a French liver tournois might be practically worthless outside of its region. For a merchant without expert guidance, navigating this chaotic bazaar of values was a massive gamble. He could make a fantastic profit on his goods, only to see it evaporate when he tried to convert his foreign earnings back into a currency he could use at home. This was the volatile world of medieval currency exchange, a domain where the exiled Templars possessed an almost supernatural foresight. Their experience operating across 3 continents had given them a real-time, panoramic view of the global flow of precious metals and the political stability that underpinned a coin's value. They didn't just understand exchange rates, they understood the reasons behind them. This deep knowledge allowed them to perform a financial magic trick known as arbitrage. The principle is simple in theory but difficult in practice. Buy low in one market, sell high in another, and pocket the difference. For the Templars, this wasn't a speculative game. It was a systematic and reliable source of income that funded their operations. Imagine a Templar official in London noticing that silver was becoming relatively scarce in England due to a new royal tax, driving up the value of English silver pennies. At the same time, his counterpart in Palermo, Sicily, reports an influx of silver from trade with North Africa, making silver coins their less valuable relative to gold. The Templar network could act on this intelligence with breathtaking speed. They would use their funds in Sicily to buy a large quantity of silver coins at the favorable rate. Then, rather than physically moving the heavy metal, they would use their internal accounting system to effectively transfer that purchasing power to London, where the silver could be sold or used to pay debts at a significant profit. They were leveraging information and their trusted network to exploit tiny, fleeting discrepancies in value across vast distances. When these masters of arbitrage were forced into exile, they carried this sophisticated understanding with them into the trading hubs that became their new homes. A former Templar treasurer settling in a city like Barcelona or Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, would have found a merchant community hungry for any advantage in the cutthroat world of Mediterranean trade. His value was immediate and immense. He could position himself as an invaluable advisor, a human calculator who could look at a proposed trade deal and instantly identify the hidden risks and opportunities lurking in the currency exchange. A merchant planning to buy spices in Cyprus might be focused solely on the price per pound of pepper. The Templar advisor would look at the deal holistically. He might caution, "The Cypriot bezant is strong now because of the recent harvest, but I have word of a new silver strike in Anatolia that will likely depress its value within the month. If you convert your funds upon arrival, you will lose 10%. Instead, use this letter with my associate there. He will hold your payment in your home currency until the price is right to convert." This guidance did more than just increase individual profits. It had a stabilizing effect on entire regional economies. By helping merchants avoid catastrophic losses from unfavorable exchange rates, the exiled Templars reduced the overall risk of engaging in long-distance trade. This encouraged more merchants, including smaller operators with less capital, to venture into international markets. As trade volume increased, so did the flow of goods, ideas, and wealth. Ports that benefited from this clandestine financial advice became more attractive and reliable trading partners, their economies growing more robust and interconnected. The Templars' mastery of arbitrage, therefore, was not a selfish skill. In exile, it became a tool for economic lubrication, smoothing out the friction in international commerce and allowing capital to flow more efficiently to where it could be most productive. They turned the chaotic noise of the medieval currency market into a symphony of calculated opportunity, conducting commerce with a steady hand that guided entire regions toward greater prosperity. So, how do we piece together this shadowy narrative when its protagonists deliberately left no signature? The challenge for the historian is not like solving a modern crime with a clear paper trail. It is more akin to archaeology, carefully sifting through layers of time to find the faint imprint of a lost culture. We will not find a royal charter signed by Robert the Bruce that says, "And special thanks to the exiled Templar treasurer for restructuring our national debt." The proof of their influence is not written in bold declarations, but in the subtle, almost invisible shifts in the economic grammar of the 14th century. It requires a particular kind of detective work, one that looks past the grand events recorded in chronicles and instead delves into the quiet, dusty world of overlooked archives. The account books of minor nobles, the ledgers of provincial merchants, the tax rolls of remote towns. It is here, in the dry columns of numbers and the formulaic language of contracts, that the ghost of Templar methodology begins to emerge. Consider the sudden appearance of a more sophisticated accounting system in the estate records of a Scottish baron in the decades following 1307. Before the exile, his finances might have been recorded on a simple, single-piece parchment. a list of rents collected on one side and expenses paid on the other, a system prone to error and offering little insight into his true wealth. Then, quite abruptly, the records change. We might see the introduction of separate ledgers for different types of assets, one for land revenues, another for income from mills, and a third for livestock. More tellingly, we might find evidence of a self-balancing system where every expense is matched against a corresponding account, a primitive form of the double-entry bookkeeping the Templars were known to have mastered. To the untrained eye, this is just a clerk becoming more diligent, but to the historian, it is a signal flare. This baron's lands were located near a known safe haven for exiled knights. The sudden leap in financial sophistication, appearing in a region with limited contact with major Italian banking centers, begs a question: who taught the clerk this new method? The most plausible answer is the arrival of an individual with advanced, non-local knowledge, precisely the kind of knowledge a fleeing Templar administrator would possess. The evidence also manifests in the sudden standardization of financial language within local merchant guilds. In a port city like Genoa or Bruges, merchant contracts were traditionally bespoke affairs, filled with unique clauses and personal guarantees that made disputes common. Then, in the early 14th century, we start to see the emergence of remarkably uniform contract templates. These documents use specific, consistent terminology for interest disguised as fees for service or gifts, for risk sharing in shipping ventures, and for the protocols of debt repayment. This language bears a striking resemblance to the contractual forms found in the few surviving Templar commercial records. The change is not mandated by any new law. It seems to spread organically, as if a particularly influential and respected member of the guild is quietly advocating for best practices. When we cross-reference this with evidence from the Templar trials, which noted the order's meticulous and standardized contracts, the connection becomes powerfully suggestive. The guilds aren't inventing these practices from whole cloth. They are adopting them from a source that has already perfected them. Another compelling line of inquiry involves tracking the flow of capital itself. Historians can analyze patterns of investment in regions that offered sanctuary. For instance, in parts of Portugal under the newly formed Order of Christ, there is a noticeable surge in funding for maritime infrastructure, shipyards, docks, navigational schools. That appears well before Prince Henry the Navigator's famous campaigns. This investment has a specific character. It is long-term, high-risk, and strategically focused, unlike the more conservative spending of typical medieval lords. It reflects a mindset accustomed to thinking in continental terms, of investing patiently for a distant payoff. This pattern of strategic, patient capital allocation is a hallmark of the Templar approach to finance, developed over centuries of managing assets across Europe. Its sudden appearance in a kingdom that had just absorbed the Templar apparatus is far more than a coincidence. It is the financial DNA of the old order expressing itself through its new, legally sanctioned body. Ultimately, building the case for the Templars' hidden influence is an exercise in assembling a mosaic. No single piece of evidence, not the improved ledger, nor the standardized contract, nor the strategic investment, can stand alone as definitive proof. But when we gather these fragments from Scotland, from Portugal, from the Alps, and from the merchant guilds, and we see that they all point in the same direction and all date from the period immediately following the dissolution, a picture begins to coalesce. The pattern is too consistent, the anomalies too concentrated in Templar-friendly regions, to be dismissed as random. We are not looking for a single signed confession. We are listening for a faint echo, a consistent financial accent that appears in disparate voices across Europe, all speaking in a dialect learned from the same silent teachers. The manuscript trail does not lead to a chest of gold, but to something far more valuable, the indelible mark of an idea, a revolutionary way of thinking about wealth that was quietly woven into the fabric of the medieval economy by masters who had learned to work without a name. Imagine the profound psychological shift for a Templar treasurer who had once managed the finances of kings. For decades, his authority was unquestioned, backed by the immense, tangible power of the order, its fortified preceptories, its legendary reputation, its direct line to the Pope. He operated from a position of overwhelming abundance, where a financial miscalculation could be absorbed by the vast reserves of the entire network. Then, in a single day, that entire world vanished. The castles were seized, the name was defamed, and the institutional power that had been his shield was gone. He was now a fugitive, perhaps carrying little more than the clothes on his back and the knowledge in his head. This catastrophic fall from grace created a pressure cooker of necessity, forcing a fundamental change in mindset. The very constraints that seemed to limit them, the lack of resources, the need for secrecy, the scale of local economies became the catalysts for a new, more refined wave of financial ingenuity. Scarcity, not abundance, became their greatest teacher. This forced shift demanded a radical simplification and adaptation of their most complex systems. The Templar banking network was designed for a continental scale, moving vast sums between major hubs like Paris, London, and Acre. But an exile hiding in the Scottish Highlands couldn't replicate that. There were no more networks of preceptories, no organized courier system, no grand treasuries. He had to take the core principles of that sophisticated system and shrink them down to a human scale. The concept of a letter of credit, which once involved intricate codes verified by commanders across thousands of miles, had to be adapted to a simple, personal promise between a few trusted individuals. This wasn't a downgrade, it was a distillation. The exile was forced to strip away all the bureaucratic layers and institutional redundancies to get to the absolute essence of the transaction, a secure transfer of value based on unwavering personal trust. This process of reduction honed their ideas to a razor's edge, making them more elegant, more efficient, and crucially, more portable. An innovation that is too complex to transplant will die with its creators. But an innovation that can be scaled down to its most basic, powerful form can take root anywhere. Perhaps the most significant psychological challenge was rebuilding their most valuable asset, trust, from a position of profound vulnerability. Before the Purge, their trust was institutional. A pilgrim trusted the Templar Order, an entity with a 200-year history. The individual brother was almost incidental. He was a representative of a powerful, reliable brand. In exile, that brand was toxic. They arrived in new communities as strangers, often with suspicious pasts they had to conceal. They couldn't say, "Trust me, I was a Templar." They had to say, through their actions alone, "Trust me as a person." This required a different kind of effort, a deeper, more personal form of integrity. Every transaction, no matter how small, became a test. Delivering a promised payment on time, providing sound financial advice that benefited a local merchant, resolving a dispute fairly, these were the bricks with which they painstakingly reconstructed their reputation. This grassroots process, while slow, ultimately created a more resilient form of trust. Institutional trust can be shattered by a royal decree, but trust earned through consistent, personal reliability is far harder to destroy. The pressure of having to prove themselves anew with every interaction forged a level of personal accountability that their previous, comfortable institutional existence may have never demanded. This environment of constraint also fueled creative problem solving in navigating local legal and social landscapes. The Templars were accustomed to operating with a degree of autonomy and legal immunity granted by the Pope. In their new homes, they were subject to the often quirky and restrictive laws of a local lord, a bishop, or a town council. The Church's prohibition on usury, which they had creatively navigated for years, was now a more immediate and dangerous threat without the protection of their order. This forced them to become even more ingenious in designing financial instruments that were both profitable and legally permissible. A loan agreement couldn't just be effective. It had to be airtight against accusations of heresy from a local priest who might be looking for any reason to cause trouble for a mysterious outsider. This pressure to operate within a tighter legal framework spurred innovations in contractual language and financial structuring that were not only clever but also more palatable and understandable to their new clients. They had to make their complex ideas accessible and acceptable to a local audience, which in turn made those ideas more easily adopted and integrated into the host economy. The need to hide their methods in plain sight, using language that was both precise and innocuous, refined their communication skills and forced a clarity that benefited everyone involved. Ultimately, this journey from institutional power to individual ingenuity may have been the key to their lasting influence. A system born in abundance can become bloated, rigid, and resistant to change. But a system forged in scarcity is lean, flexible, and inherently adaptable. The economic models the exiles developed in the crucible of their new lives were not theoretical exercises. They were practical solutions to immediate problems of survival and prosperity. They were tested daily in the real world, refined through trial and error, and proven effective on a small scale before they were ever adopted more widely. This made them incredibly robust. When a Scottish merchant saw that the exiled advisor's method for structuring a ship insurance pool actually worked, preventing ruin from a single storm, that practice became local custom. It wasn't imposed from on high by a distant institution. It was adopted because it demonstrably improved people's lives. The pressure cooker of Exile did not destroy the Templars' knowledge, it purified it. It forced them to innovate not for the sake of complexity, but for the sake of simplicity and effectiveness, creating a set of economic tools that were so practical, so efficient, and so valuable that they couldn't help but be absorbed into the very fabric of the societies that had offered them refuge. The vast network of Templar preceptories gave them a unique, panoramic view of the dangers that plagued medieval trade routes. They understood that a merchant's greatest fear wasn't just a bad deal. It was the total loss of his cargo to a sudden storm in the Mediterranean or a band of pirates lurking off the coast of Cyprus. A single shipwreck could mean financial ruin, wiping out not just the potential profit but the entire capital investment, potentially destroying a family business that had taken generations to build. To address this existential threat, the Templars developed what amounted to an early form of commercial insurance. For a fee, a merchant shipping goods from, say, Marseille to Acre could pay the order a premium. In return, the Templars would guarantee that if the ship was lost to pirates, storms, or other documented perils, they would reimburse the merchant for the value of his cargo. This was a revolutionary concept. It transformed trade from a terrifying gamble into a calculated risk. A merchant could now sleep at night, knowing that even a catastrophe at sea would not spell his utter destitution. This safety net encouraged the movement of goods on an unprecedented scale, as merchants were willing to undertake longer, more profitable voyages, knowing they had a powerful backer sharing the risk. After their exile, these formal, order-backed guarantees evaporated. The Templars no longer had the institutional wealth or the legal authority to underwrite such massive risks directly. But the knowledge of how to structure these agreements did not disappear. It became another piece of intellectual treasure carried by the fleeing brothers, a conceptual tool they could teach to others. In their new homes within bustling port cities and merchant guilds, they found a ready audience for this expertise. The great merchant leagues of the era, like the Hanseatic League in the Baltic or the merchant councils of Italian city-states, were already experimenting with ways to protect their members. The exiled Templars could offer them a proven, systematic approach. They might have advised these groups on formalizing mutual insurance funds. The idea was simple yet powerful. Instead of each merchant bearing the full risk of a voyage alone, a group would pool a small portion of their capital into a common fund. If one member's ship was lost, the fund would cover the loss, spreading the financial impact across the entire membership. This collective approach meant that no single disaster could destroy an individual trader, while the group as a whole remained strong. The introduction of this risk mitigation framework had a democratizing effect on medieval commerce. Before such systems, long-distance trade was largely the domain of the ultra-wealthy. Only those with vast reserves of capital could absorb the shock of a lost shipment. Smaller merchants and aspiring traders were often locked out, forced to stick to safer, less profitable local routes. But with the advent of mutual insurance modeled on Templar principles, the barriers to entry began to fall. A merchant with a single ship and a modest cargo could now join a guild or a league, pay his premiums into the common fund, and gain the confidence to send his goods across the sea. This influx of new participants injected tremendous vitality into regional economies. More merchants meant more competition, which often led to better prices and a greater variety of goods. It also spurred innovation in shipbuilding and navigation, as the increased volume of trade created demand for larger, faster, and more seaworthy vessels. The quiet advice of a few knowledgeable exiles, sharing the Templar philosophy of shared risk, helped to unlock the entrepreneurial potential of an entire class of traders who had previously been too vulnerable to participate. The cumulative impact of these scattered innovations was not merely a collection of isolated improvements. It functioned as a powerful, integrated system that, over time, conferred a distinct competitive edge upon the regions that had, either by design or by chance, absorbed the exiled Templars. Think of it not as a single loud event, but as a quiet, persistent drizzle that gradually nourishes the soil, allowing certain crops to thrive while others stagnate. A port city that adopted more reliable systems for letters of credit became a safer and more efficient hub for international merchants. A principality that implemented superior accounting could manage its finances with unprecedented clarity, allowing for more strategic long-term investments in infrastructure or military defense. A region where merchant guilds had embraced pooled risk insurance saw a surge in commercial ventures as the fear of catastrophic loss no longer stifled ambition. Individually, each of these advantages was significant. Together, they created a synergistic effect that made these Templar-influenced zones noticeably more attractive to the flow of capital and commerce than their neighbors. This economic magnetism would have set in motion a self-reinforcing cycle of growth. As trade began to favor these more secure and sophisticated hubs, the volume of goods passing through their markets increased. This, in turn, generated higher tax revenues for local rulers without the need to raise tax rates, providing funds for further improvements, better roads, larger harbors, stronger fortifications. The increased economic activity attracted skilled craftsmen, ambitious merchants, and innovative thinkers from less dynamic regions, creating a brain drain that further enriched the thriving area while impoverishing its competitors. A city like Bruges, where Templar-trained individuals may have integrated into the merchant guilds, didn't just become a slightly better place to do business. It began to pull trade away from older, more traditional centers that were slow to adapt. The economic landscape of Europe began to subtly realign, not because of royal decrees or military conquests, but because of the silent, underground migration of superior financial knowledge. The rise of certain city-states and principalities in the late Middle Ages begins to look different when viewed through this lens. Consider the remarkable ascent of Portugal, which we've already explored. Its transformation from a small kingdom on the Iberian fringe into a pioneering global maritime power was fueled by the direct, institutionalized application of Templar economic models through the Order of Christ. The patient, strategic capital required to fund decades of exploration down the African coast was a direct legacy of the Templar approach to long-term investment. Similarly, the economic resilience and growing sophistication of Scotland after the Wars of Independence, or the emergence of the Swiss cantons as bastions of financial discretion, align curiously well with the patterns of Templar dispersal. These regions gained a head start, a kind of economic firmware upgrade that allowed them to operate more efficiently and anticipate future trends more effectively than their peers. This ripple effect demonstrates a profound historical truth that the transfer of knowledge, especially practical, applied knowledge, can be a more powerful force for change than the transfer of raw power or territory. The exiled Templars were not conquerors, they were carriers. They did not arrive with armies to impose a new economic order by force. Instead, they arrived as individuals and small groups, offering their skills as a service. The lords and merchants who employed them were likely not thinking in grand, historical terms. They were simply seeking a competitive edge for their own personal or regional benefit. They saw a useful advisor, a brilliant bookkeeper, a shrewd negotiator. They did not see themselves as participants in a clandestine project to rewire the medieval economy. Yet, by adopting these advanced practices, they inadvertently set in motion a chain reaction that altered the destiny of their communities. The advantage was subtle at first, perhaps just a few more trading ships choosing their port over another. But over decades, that slight edge compounded into a decisive lead, shifting the center of economic gravity in ways that contemporary chroniclers, focused on battles and royal successions, would have found mysterious and inexplicable. The true power of the Templar legacy was not in a hidden treasure, but in this invisible current of economic advantage, a ripple that spread from the quiet work of a few exiles to reshape the map of European prosperity. But to truly grasp the impact of this Templar innovation, we need to first understand the typical and often brutal reality of medieval landholding for the common person. For most peasants, their relationship with the land was one of profound insecurity. They might be serfs, bound to a specific lord and plot, or they might be free tenants, but in either case, their tenure was often short-term and subject to the whims of their landlord. A lease might be for a single year, or even just from one harvest to the next. This created a cycle of short-sighted desperation. Why would a farmer invest his sweat and meager resources into improving a field? By draining a bog, fertilizing the soil, or planting a fruit orchard, if he had no guarantee he would be there to reap the benefits in 5 or 10 years. The risk was all his, while the long-term gain would likely flow to the landlord or the next tenant. This system discouraged innovation and trapped agriculture in a state of subsistence-level stagnation. The land was mined for its immediate yield, not nurtured as a long-term asset. The Templars approached their vast landholdings with a completely different mindset, one shaped by their need for predictable, sustainable income to fund their operations across the globe. They weren't absentee aristocrats viewing their estates as mere sources of rent. They were institutional managers who thought in terms of centuries, not seasons. To ensure stability, they pioneered the widespread use of long-term leases, often spanning multiple generations of a single family. A tenant might be granted a lease for 20, 30, or even 50 years with clearly defined rents and responsibilities. This simple change in the time frame of the agreement was revolutionary. Suddenly, the farmer had a powerful incentive to improve the land. If he invested in better drainage, he knew his children would enjoy the resulting higher yields. If he planted a vineyard, he could be confident he would harvest the grapes for decades to come. The tenant's prosperity became directly linked to the long-term health and productivity of the soil, aligning his interests perfectly with those of the Templar landlords. The land was no longer a resource to be exploited, but a partnership to be cultivated. This philosophy extended to their use of sharecropping agreements, which were often far more equitable than the oppressive versions common elsewhere. Instead of demanding a fixed, crippling portion of the harvest regardless of the yield, the Templars frequently structured agreements that shared both the risk and the reward. A common model might be a 50-50 split of the harvest after the seeds for the next planting were set aside. In a bad year, both the order and the tenant felt the pain, but the farmer wasn't driven into starvation or debt slavery. In a bumper year, both parties prospered. This fairness built tremendous loyalty and stability within the communities living on Templar lands. The peasants were not just subjects, they were stakeholders in a shared agricultural enterprise. This resulted in more peaceful, productive, and resilient local economies, which in turn provided the Templars with the reliable food supplies and rental income they required to function as an international organization. When the Purge scattered these estate managers across Europe, they carried this enlightened approach to land management with them like a precious seed. An exiled Templar, perhaps once the steward of a dozen preceptories in France, might find employment with a local baron in England or a bishop in Italy. He would arrive at an estate that was likely mired in the old, inefficient cycle of short-term leases and adversarial landlord-tenant relationships. His first task would be to demonstrate the value of a longer view. He might advise the baron to offer a key tenant a 20-year lease on a particularly troublesome parcel of marshy land, with a clause that any improvements made by the tenant would be reflected in a slightly higher but fair rent. To the baron, this might seem like a loss of immediate control, but the Templar steward could frame it as a strategic investment. The tenant, secure in his future, would have the motivation to drain the marsh himself, turning worthless bog into productive farmland. The baron's income would rise, and his estate's overall value would increase, all without him having to spend a single penny of his own capital. The exiled Templar was essentially teaching a new economic calculus, that stability and security for the farmer were not acts of charity, but the foundation of increased wealth for the landowner. By implementing these Templar-style agreements, these stewards helped rewire the rural economic base from the ground up. The effect was a gradual but profound increase in agricultural productivity across entire regions. With tenants invested in the long-term health of the land, they adopted better crop rotation practices, invested in better tools, and took care of the soil. This led to surplus production, which could be sold at market, generating new wealth that circulated within the local economy rather than being extracted by a distant and indifferent lord. Villages became more prosperous and self-sufficient, capable of weathering poor harvests without collapsing into famine or rebellion. This quiet transformation of the countryside, this shift from a feudal model of extraction to a more capitalist model of investment and growth, was one of the Templars' most significant and overlooked legacies. They helped demonstrate that the most valuable crop a landlord could cultivate was not wheat or barley, but the security and initiative of the people who worked the land. This delicate dance with financial ethics was not some minor technicality. It was a central challenge that defined the entire medieval economy. The Church's prohibition on usury, the charging of interest on loans, was absolute and rooted in Scripture. To lend money and demand more in return was seen as exploitation, a sin against charity that profited from another's misfortune. For an ordinary moneylender, this was a straightforward barrier. But for the Templars, who were first and foremost a religious order, the stakes were infinitely higher. Their entire banking operation, so crucial to their mission, risked being condemned as a massive, organized exercise in heresy. They couldn't simply ignore the rule. They had to innovate around it, creating financial instruments so cleverly designed that they operated in the gray areas of canon law. Their genius lay not in defiance but in reinterpretation, framing their necessary profits not as interest, but as compensation for very real services rendered. Take their most famous instrument, the letter of credit. A pilgrim depositing 100 gold coins in Paris didn't simply get back 100 coins in Jerusalem. The Templars would deduct a fee, but how was this fee justified? It wasn't presented as interest on a loan. Instead, it was a charge for a complex suite of services: the physical security of storing the funds in their fortified treasury, the labor of their scribes who created the coded document, the risk assumed in transporting the value across thousands of miles, and the convenience provided to the traveler. The profit was neatly wrapped inside a package of tangible, valuable labor. Similarly, when they engaged in currency exchange, the profit was framed as a legitimate adjustment for the differing values of coins in various markets, a reward for their expertise and the logistical headache of managing multiple currencies. This wasn't a semantic trick, it was a sophisticated argument that recognized the intrinsic value of financial services themselves. They were arguing, in effect, that their knowledge, their security, and their network had a price, separate from the mere act of lending. In Exile, stripped of their institutional authority, this ethical balancing act became even more critical. They were now operating on a knife's edge, their survival dependent on the goodwill of local communities and the tolerance of church authorities. A single misstep, an accusation of usury from a local bishop, could unravel everything. This pressure forced an even greater refinement of their methods. An exiled Templar financier working for a merchant guild couldn't rely on the faded reputation of his order to shield him. He had to demonstrate through every transaction that his profits were not only fair but ethically sound. This meant structuring deals with unparalleled transparency and fairness. A loan to a local craftsman to expand his workshop wouldn't be a simple cash advance with a hidden interest rate. Instead, it might be structured as an investment partnership. The Templar would provide the capital, and in return, he would receive a share of the workshop's profits for a fixed period. The profit was directly tied to the success he helped create, a reward for shared risk and enterprise, not for the mere passage of time. This model felt more like a joint venture than a predatory loan, making it far more palatable to a society steeped in religious doctrine. By operating in this scrupulously ethical manner, these exiled financiers did more than just protect themselves. They became living proof that finance and morality were not inherently opposed. They showed their new communities that it was possible to facilitate commerce, to enable growth, and to make a profit without resorting to exploitation. A Scottish baron who received sound financial advice from an exile and saw his estate's revenues grow without oppressing his tenants learned a powerful lesson. A group of merchants in Bruges who used a Templar-inspired insurance pool to save one of their members from ruin saw finance not as a destructive force, but as a tool for mutual protection and community resilience. This daily demonstration of ethical finance began to slowly erode the deep-seated suspicion surrounding non-agricultural profit. The ultimate impact of this quiet campaign was a gradual but profound shift in the medieval worldview. For centuries, wealth creation had been largely associated with land ownership, or more negatively, with usury. The exiled Templars, through their actions, helped introduce a third category: legitimate profit from the application of skill, knowledge, and risk management in the service of commerce. They helped create a moral and intellectual space where banking could eventually be seen not as a necessary evil, but as a respectable profession. They didn't single-handedly overthrow the Church's ban on usury, but they provided a practical, working model of how to navigate it, demonstrating that financial ingenuity could serve the common good. This redefinition of economic morality, forged in the crucible of their exile, was an essential precondition for the commercial revolutions that would follow, subtly preparing the European mind for the idea that capital, when managed with wisdom and integrity, could be a force for progress rather than a source of sin. And so we arrive at the final, most profound irony of their entire story. The very strategies that ensured the survival of the Templars' revolutionary ideas also guaranteed that their source would be systematically scrubbed from history. Their legacy is one of profound influence paired with near-total anonymity, a paradox where success was measured by the completeness of their own disappearance. The need for secrecy was not a choice, it was a matter of survival. For an exiled Templar who had painstakingly built a new life and a position of trust in a Scottish court or a Portuguese trading house, any public acknowledgement of his true origins would have been catastrophic. It would have been an invitation for agents of the French crown or the Inquisition to come knocking, resulting in certain arrest, the seizure of any assets he had helped accumulate, and the utter destruction of the fragile economic networks he had helped to build. Recognition was a death sentence, both for the individual and for the influence he wielded. Therefore, the first and most important rule of their new existence was to never, under any circumstances, claim credit. This imperative for anonymity was reinforced by the very method through which their knowledge was transferred. They weren't writing textbooks or delivering university lectures on economic theory. The transmission of Templar financial wisdom happened through the quiet, patient medium of apprenticeship and practical demonstration. A former Templar treasurer, now serving as a steward, wouldn't sit a young clerk down and say, "Let me teach you the secret banking methods of my fallen order." Instead, he would simply do his job with an unparalleled level of skill. He would teach the clerk how to balance the ledgers using a double entry system by having him practice it daily. He would explain the structure of a fair, profit-sharing loan agreement when the need for one naturally arose in the course of business. The knowledge was passed down not as a formal doctrine called Templar finance, but as a collection of best practices learned from a remarkably capable mentor. The origin of these practices became irrelevant. What mattered was their undeniable utility. The student learned the what and the how without ever needing to learn the who or the why behind it. Furthermore, the people who benefited most from this hidden expertise had absolutely no incentive to publicize its source. Consider a Flemish merchant guild whose profits soared after adopting new risk pooling techniques introduced by a quiet, knowledgeable new member. Why would they ever advertise that their success was indebted to a man from an order condemned as heretical by the Pope? To do so would risk tainting their own reputation and inviting scrutiny from church authorities. It was far safer and far more prestigious to let these innovations be seen as homegrown genius, a natural evolution of their own commercial acumen. Similarly, a king like Robert the Bruce of Scotland, who relied on these shadowy financiers to stabilize his kingdom's economy, would never openly credit a banned organization. For a monarch struggling for legitimacy against England and the papacy, associating his reign with the Templars would be a disastrous political move. It was far better to let the economic improvements speak for themselves, allowing the public and rivals alike to simply assume the king and his ministers were brilliant administrators. The beneficiaries became unwitting accomplices in the cover-up, because acknowledging their secret weapon would have undermined their own credibility and power. Over time, this combination of forced silence and convenient ignorance led to a process of total assimilation. The Templars' sophisticated financial tools didn't just spread, they dissolved. They seeped into the groundwater of European commerce, losing all connection to their original source. A standardized contract used by a merchant in Genoa, a double-entry ledger system in a London counting house, a long-term lease agreement on a farm in Aragon, these ceased to be Templar techniques. They just became the way business is done. The innovations became so deeply embedded in common practice that their revolutionary nature faded from memory. We see a similar process today with technologies like the Internet. Most people use it without any understanding of its origins in military research projects. The tool becomes ubiquitous, and its controversial or secretive beginnings are forgotten in the face of its overwhelming utility. The Templars' financial revolution succeeded precisely because it became invisible, its origins blurred beyond recognition by the sheer force of its own effectiveness. This erasure from the historical record is, in a strange way, their greatest and most poignant achievement. It proves the ultimate success of their mission of survival and dissemination. Their goal after the purge was not to be remembered, but to ensure that their knowledge endured. The complete absorption of their ideas into the mainstream is the clearest possible evidence that they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The ultimate historical irony is that we search for their legacy in all the wrong places. We look for hidden treasure maps and secret symbols carved into stone when the real treasure is hiding in plain sight. It is in the very foundations of our modern economic system, in the concept of a checking account, the structure of a joint stock company, the principles of insurance and international credit. The Templars' most brilliant maneuver was not a military campaign or a financial transaction. It was a feat of historical ghostwriting. They authored a new chapter in the story of capitalism, then carefully erased their own names from the text, leaving behind only the powerful, world-changing ideas themselves. So if the essential ingredients of modern capitalism were beginning to simmer in the late Middle Ages, what was the catalyst that brought them all together into a transformative brew? We often picture the rise of the market economy as an inevitable, organic process, bubbling up from the collective actions of merchants and bankers in thriving city-states. But progress is rarely so straightforward. Revolutionary ideas, especially complex financial ones, need carriers, individuals, or groups who can transport them across political and cultural boundaries and demonstrate their practical value. The great merchant families of Italy are rightly celebrated for their role, but the story of the exiled Templars suggests a parallel, underground current of innovation, one that flowed not from the open ledgers of counting houses, but from the minds of masters who had been forced to operate in the shadows. They became the unsung couriers of a financial revolution, providing a crucial bridge between the old, monolithic economic power of the Church and the new, decentralized and dynamic world of commerce that was struggling to be born. Think of the Templar system not as a prototype of capitalism, but as a kind of pre-packaged economic toolkit. Within their centralized, quasi-monastic organization, they had been forced to develop, refine, and integrate all the components we now associate with a modern economy. They had banking in the form of their letters of credit and deposit services. They had sophisticated credit instruments for both kings and commoners. They had an early form of insurance to mitigate commercial risk, and they had an accounting system, possibly double entry, that provided a clear picture of their vast and complex financial health. This entire toolkit was developed to serve a single, massive, non-profit entity. But when the order was shattered, the toolkit didn't vanish. It was broken apart, and its individual tools were distributed into the hands of men who now had to use them for personal and local survival. This was the critical shift. The same financial techniques that had been used to manage the wealth of a unified religious army were now being applied to fuel the ambitions of individual Scottish lords, Portuguese explorers, and German merchant leagues. The knowledge was being democratized. This process of transfer helps solve a persistent historical puzzle. We know that these advanced financial practices begin to appear more widely in European commerce in the 14th and 15th centuries. But how did they spread so quickly? The traditional explanation focuses on the Italian city-states, and their role is undeniable. However, the Templar diaspora offers a complementary and equally compelling vector. Their dispersal was not random. It was strategically targeted towards the very regions Scotland, Portugal, Switzerland, the independent trading cities, that were on the periphery of the dominant feudal powers. These were the places where new economic models could take root with less interference from tradition-bound authorities. The exiles didn't just bring isolated tricks, they brought a coherent system. A merchant in Bruges might learn about insurance from a Hanseatic trader, but a Templar integrated advisor could show him how insurance interlocked with reliable credit and accurate accounting to create a far more resilient and profitable business model. They were teaching a holistic approach to finance. The true missing link they provide is in the realm of scale and trust. The Italian merchant banks were brilliant, but they were often family-run enterprises. Their trust networks were based on bloodlines and tightly knit partnerships. The Templars, by contrast, had built an impersonal, institutional form of trust that transcended family, language, and nationality. A pilgrim from England could trust a Templar house in Jerusalem, not because he knew the commander, but because he trusted the institution's flawless reputation. This concept of systemic rather than personal trust is a cornerstone of modern capitalism. When the exiles began rebuilding their networks from scratch, they were essentially creating new, smaller-scale versions of this impersonal trust. A code word between a financier in Lisbon and one in Edinburgh was a primitive form of the institutional credibility that today allows you to use a credit card anywhere in the world with confidence. They were helping to pioneer the idea that economic reliability could be embedded in a system, not just in a personal relationship. Ultimately, their greatest contribution may have been psychological. Before their influence, profit from finance was often viewed with deep suspicion, tainted by the sin of usury. The Templars, as a religious order, had been forced to navigate this moral minefield with creativity and care. They demonstrated that financial services providing security, managing risk, facilitating trade, had a legitimate value that could be ethically compensated. In their new lives, they continued to model this principle by showing that one could be both pious and profitable, that financial ingenuity could serve the common good by stabilizing kingdoms and enabling commerce. They helped to chip away at the medieval prejudice against non-agrarian wealth creation. They didn't invent the tools of capitalism single-handedly, but they played a vital role in sanitizing them, in making them acceptable and respectable. Their story completes the circuit, explaining how the powerful economic technologies developed within a unique, centralized institution could escape its collapse and become the birthright of a burgeoning commercial world, quietly wiring the foundations for the economic system that would one day span the globe. The story of the exiled Templars is ultimately a testament to the power of ideas over institutions. Their physical order was destroyed in a storm of fire and accusation, but the economic intelligence it cultivated, the very system of thought that made them the master bankers of the medieval world, did not perish. It survived, carried in the minds of those who escaped, scattered like seeds on the wind to distant and unexpected soils. In the remote highlands of Scotland, the bustling ports of Portugal, and the independent valleys of the Alps, these seeds took root. They did not grow into new military orders or secret societies. Instead, they quietly germinated into the very practices we now recognize as the foundation of modern finance. The trusted letter of credit evolved into the checking account. The shared risk pool became the basis for insurance. The meticulous, double-entry ledger provided the clarity necessary for complex corporations to flourish. Their true legacy, therefore, is not a hidden treasure map leading to a chest of gold and jewels. It is something far more pervasive and powerful, the very financial infrastructure we use and often take for granted every single day. It is the invisible architecture of trust that allows us to invest in a business on another continent, to insure our homes against disaster, and to manage complex economies. This hidden history challenges us to look beyond the official records, beyond the chronicles of kings and popes, and to consider the profound, often unrecorded impact of underground knowledge networks. It suggests that the most significant revolutions are not always fought on battlefields or declared in palaces. Sometimes they are quietly engineered by outcasts and exiles who carry the blueprints for a new world in their memories. If this journey into the shadowy corridors of economic history has fascinated you, if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten forces that secretly shaped our modern world, then consider subscribing to this channel for more deep dives into the past. We have so many more untold stories to explore together, and we would love to hear your thoughts on these mysterious financiers. What aspect of the Templars' hidden legacy surprised you the most? Share your perspectives and questions in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation.